LanzaTech Chief Sustainability Officer Freya Burton. Over to you, Van.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so I don't know how many of you have heard, but the Earth is hot right now. It's maybe the hottest it's ever been in recorded history. And when you look at things like the recent climate report that came out of the United States, it looks like it's going to be very difficult to reach some of the most optimistic carbon goals over the next decade, the next 2 decades. And lots of people are pessimistic, especially with the United States pulling out of Paris. But we have 3 members of a panel here who are going to tell us some ways that we can actually perhaps reverse some of the carbon emission and carbon cycle.
Rick, can I also grab...
Yeah, some exciting stuff. So, first up, I wanted to start with Christoph. So, you have told me before we got started here about some really exciting things about, people talk about stopping carbon emissions. People talk about reducing them, but nobody talks about getting rid of the carbon that's already been emitted into the atmosphere. But you might have a way to do that, correct?
Yes, thanks, Van. So hi there, I'm Christoph. I'm one of the founders of Climeworks. We are a startup based in Zurich, Switzerland. And what we do is we build machines that capture CO2 from the air with 2 products. By doing that, that is what you just mentioned, Van. That's air without CO2, and that's, in this game, the relevant part, as well as CO2. So I'm very happy to share with you that since around a month, we have a plant in Iceland in operation which takes CO2 from the air and puts the CO2 underground. And in Iceland, we have those very favorable conditions that the CO2, once you put it underground, it's mineralized very fast. So we literally turn CO2 into stone. And in such, we remove CO2 permanently and safely from the atmosphere to achieve what you just mentioned.
So if we could, say, talk about scale or maybe the future of this technology, could you see certain pieces of the Earth, certain actors being used maybe as carbon sinks for pulling carbon from high emitters elsewhere?
Well, yes, I could see places, for example, a place like Iceland, where we're doing, and the emissions we are addressing is especially, the emissions which cannot be addressed otherwise. So, for example, the electric vehicle is in the media more or less every day, but battery production does have associated emissions. And by what we are doing, we can help to reduce those emissions to 0 at first place, and for the future, to achieve climate targets, we could go negative to reduce the CO2 content in the atmosphere.
So Freya, you have a sort of related technology you're working on that takes the carbon and takes waste products and makes useful products from that. So can you tell me how those 2 things are involved in the carbon cycle and exactly what you're doing?
Absolutely. So essentially, it's like brewing beer, but instead got a lot of people's attention. It's actually taking, instead of sugars and yeast, we take waste emissions, so pollution, and we use a bacteria. And the bacteria ferments the pollution, and as a product of its growth, it actually makes new products, chemicals and fuels that we can drop in to the fuel pool. Fuels which are especially important for the sectors that can't be electrified, so aviation fuels, for example. So it's a sort of pollution to product story. That's what we do.
So you can make beer?
I don't think I would drink what we're making, to be fair.
And so we talked before about some sort of synergies between Christoph and your work about pulling carbon and also using it in your products. So can you explain how that might work in the future?
Absolutely. I think how any kind of synergy might work is when LanzaTech actually takes carbon before it's emitted. So from industries, for example, like heavy manufacturing like steel, they have emissions that would otherwise be combusted and released as CO2. That would then get captured by Climeworks type of technology, and there would be a source of CO2 there that could be fed into a process like ours.
Okay. Jyoti, we have two excellent examples of companies that are doing this kind of work now, but in your career as a titan in this industry, you've seen several more. So what are you seeing on both the supply side and the demand side of pulling different pieces of the industry together in synergies like this that reduce carbon emissions?
Yeah, so when we talk about climate change, we wish to now reduce fossil fuels use so that we can control CO2 emissions. Fossil fuels are used quite a lot in power sector, but also so that comes through to us in indirect form of electricity, but we also use them directly in transport sector and several other industry and several other sectors. So everywhere we have to be economic. In supply side, we have to see how much less we can use coal, oil and gas and instead use solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, biomass, and so on. And then we should also see on the demand side, which means the energy users. Energy users are using it for electricity or fuels in transport sector, buildings, agriculture. So in all sectors, we have to try to reduce this. Now, we have made very great progress in energy efficiency also, so that is also reducing our energy, what we could do for now, whether it is running computers or LED bulbs, now we can do it with 1/3 the energy, 1/10 sometimes in LED bulbs. So that is a very important milestone and very important. What these two experts are talking about is the sucking out the carbon from whatever we have emitted and doing the right thing from the past emissions. But it has to be scaled up and it has to be affordable and nations should vote for it, go for it. So also there are other enabling technology which is like awareness, knowledge spreading, also internet, mobile, and computers and so on. All of these help us reducing emissions by online purchases, online business and so on. So people travel less for that reason. And when they travel less, you have less CO2 emissions.
So ideally, especially in the industrializing world, what is an appropriate mix, do you think, of low emissions, no emissions, and negative emissions technology in the energy profile of the future?
I would prefer no or negative because I think we have not much time left. We have already crossed CO2 limits quite high. But at the same time, there are many people, 30% people in the world who do not have access to energy. They would need access to at least electricity, lights, cooking, and basic functions. So their emissions will rise. When one part of the globe will have a somewhat rising emissions, though now they can leapfrog and with using LED bulbs, they can have light at 1/10 CO2 emission than before. But still, and if it is renewable, not at all. But still, they would need more energy and more CO2 for their development. So yes, I think industrialized world, if they do more, that would be fair.
So you mentioned scale before, and Christoph and Freya, I wanted to hear more about the scale of your companies, of your efforts. They're both at commercial scale, right? Mm-hmm. Let's start first, Christoph.
Yes, we are at commercial scale. This year we started our first commercial plant. It captures 1,000 tons of CO2 from the atmosphere per year and supplies that for a customer application. Of course, 1,000 tons and in terms of climate change is nothing. We talk about gigatons. But what we feel, or we often ask the scale question, do we address scale? So from a technological perspective, our technology is modular. It's rather a small scale. So we talk about CO2 collectors, borrowing the name from the solar collector. And the CO2 collector has the same dimensions as a car. It weighs 2,000 kilograms. It's like 2 times 2 times 2 meters. So we feel that there is production infrastructure available which can produce on a massive scale at a low cost what we're doing today. So this will be the next step for us forward in order to meet the scale challenge, is to execute in terms of production capacities and knowledge what's already around and sort of leverage this for our technology.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've been told before, if it doesn't scale, it doesn't matter. So technology might be great, but if you can't get it up to scale, what's the point? You need people to buy into it, and for that, it needs to be economic. And that's always been close to how we've developed the technology. So we're building our first 2 commercial facilities, one in China using steel emissions, and one in Europe, in Belgium, again using steel emissions. But we can, and the fuel that we would produce would be comparable to the lowest cost alternative fuels available today. So in terms of economics, it makes sense. In terms of reach and scale, our technology could be, I suppose, retrofitted onto all the steel mills in the world. It could also use other types of inputs, so heavy industry, refining, waste emissions that would otherwise go into the atmosphere. Landfill waste, instead of incinerating it, you could gasify it, and that could also be used. So there's resources all over the world that our technology could access. So in terms of scale, it's a phenomenal opportunity.
So what about policy when we talk about scale? What entities in government are you working with? What policies have you found effective for scale, and what might be ineffective?
Ineffective. And I think policy, often in technology development, you think, oh, the technology is going to be the hardest part. But actually, we found it's the legislative process. When you have such a disruptive technology that we're developing, you need to educate a lot of people and help them think differently. So for us, the technologies, the policy that would support these types of technologies would be technology neutral. They're not fixated on you just using plant-based biomass. Today, all the fuel legislation for renewables supports only plant-based fuels. And if we need to meet our 2-degree targets, preferably 1.5-degree targets, you're going to need everything to contribute. Back to Jyoti's point about, we'd love to have it 0 and negative, but you're going to need lots of things to contribute. So technology neutral policies, like the low carbon fuel standard in California, these are the ones that would really support scale of more technologies.
So, Jyoti, when we talk about policy, it's not divorced from the people, right? The society in which you're implementing things matters, and people, I think, they have a bit of an ambivalent attitude towards tech right now. How do you get people on board with the 2-degree goal, with moving forward with adapting new technologies, and with changing their lives and their perception of energy?
Well, one thing of great concern in developing countries is affordable technology. So pricing of these technologies is very important for them. Then secondly, it should be convenient to them. If it is really going out of their way too much, they also don't accept it. Some legal mandate would be good at times to push people into that direction. And fourth thing is the awareness and knowledge why they have to do this, and what is the reason why these technologies are good for just not them, but for the globe as a whole. So that knowledge also helps them to adopt the new technologies. But I feel also that technology, the question is here, can technology save us from climate change? I think there is also a question of consumption patterns, how we need to change the way we live and way we think. And we buy food that we don't eat, we buy things that accumulate in our closets and so on. And all that adds up to also CO2 emissions a lot.
So on stage now, we have a journalist, we have a Nobel Prize winner, researcher, we have 2 people from the private sector. This type of conversation doesn't happen often. How do you, when you're talking about technology saving us, you're talking about lots of different entities working together. how do you begin talking about not just scaling up your own operations, but scaling up synergies? How do you talk about building cross-technology synergies, building maybe partnerships within the tech field? How do you start that, Christoph?
Well, by doing this, like taking part at whatever opportunity we have in order to meet people like Freya and connect and do partnerships. We are part of many European Union-funded projects, for example, with dozens of university partners, and those are the seeds for later industrial applications. We published a lot when we started, so I would say we are heavily scientific, or we have a heavy scientific backbone, and from where we come, like as a university spin-off. So this planted seeds for partnerships. So there were actually many strategies or many routes how we could establish such links or partnerships.
So much of the conversation about climate change still centers on Silicon Valley, on a handful of American companies that get lots of press. But do you think now with American policy in climate change receding, is that an opportunity for global companies to be maybe the leaders in the field? Freya?
Yeah, I actually think after Paris, you really saw a difference in the tone of the COP talks, because this was when businesses all came together, regardless of where they were based. And that's followed on since the Paris climate talks, where companies from around the world are coming together under umbrella commitments, so 100% renewable energy, or a new one called Below 50, which is companies across the supply chain coming together to promote the use of fuels with a greenhouse gas reduction potential of 50% or more. And this is a trend that we're seeing, that it's not just in one place, say in Silicon Valley, but everyone coming together, knowing that our 2-degree scenario is, well, we're sort of kind of waving it goodbye, and we're heading to 3 at the moment. And I think it's definitely happening already.
So Jyoti, I'm going to ask you a question I asked at the last panel we were on, because your answer was just so insightful. Thinking about people in places that aren't funded by the EU, places that are newly industrializing across the world, and that may have just invested lots of money in maybe their first complete coal power grid. What is the incentive? How do we get places like that have just developed sort of mature industrialized power grids to think, okay, we're going to invest again more money into a green system, a sustainable system? How do you get those people on board?
I think one does have to do careful planning, and everybody's interest must be looked after. And if something has to be phased out, it has to be done in a planned manner, not tomorrow you close down your industry. But also another issue is that you can talk about co-benefits. There are air pollution benefits for the fossil fuel, electric car, for example, or fossil fuels based car. The one saves a lot of air pollution, also noise pollution. So these additional benefits, sometimes it creates more jobs. Renewable energy might not create as many jobs, but they will create it where they are needed. So if I live in a city, and if I am a manufacturer, I can put in the rooftops. So it's not that I have to go out somewhere in the middle of mines, but can do it wherever. So you can have a lot of entrepreneurs spread across the places where they live. So these jobs are good.
So Freya, in the last couple of minutes that we have, I want you to get out your crystal ball and give us a sense of where you expect the technology in your field to be in 5 years, and maybe where there are opportunities for people to adopt it en masse.
Yeah, I hopefully not 5 years, because I think that's too late. I think we have to be doing stuff now. It's not about our children's future, it's about our future. But I really see a change in how we treat carbon. This is something that both Christoph and I feel very strongly about, in the sense that carbon doesn't have to be a liability. It can be an opportunity. And until we start thinking about where we source our energy and what we do, how our carbon's distributed, we're not going to move forward. And I think people are starting to see that. I hope that's the case, that people will start thinking about recycling carbon, using it differently, and sourcing electricity from 100% renewable sources rather than driving carbon into the grid where it doesn't really have a place anymore.
Christoph, an extension of that question, when we talk about recapturing carbon, it sounds like you're imagining a future where carbon is considered a resource, a currency, perhaps, part of the global financial chain. What changes business globally when that becomes the dominant perspective? How does that change how we think about commerce?
Well, it changes maybe one of the most significant industries we have on this planet, which is the oil and gas industry. It's, I think, the biggest industry we have on our planet. They're producing an equivalent of 11 to 12 gigatons of CO2 annually. And if we were to capture CO2 from the air, in the best case assumptions, like scientists assume that we have to capture 10 to 15 gigatons annually from the atmosphere, meaning that in the next 20 to 30 years, a new industry will develop of the size of today's oil industry, where today there's a handful of partners doing that. So it'll be a tremendous shift in industry. And, well, on the one hand, it's a disconnect. It's frightening to hear this. On the other hand, for entrepreneurs, it's a huge opportunity and a huge playground to establish new technologies.
And Jyoti, in about the minute we have left, you're talking about financial opportunities for companies. How do you align those financial incentives with justice, with making sure that people are held accountable and making sure that people, in the end, the end product is a safer, cleaner Earth?
No, financial incentives are necessary for many technologies in the initial phase, but then they should be working on their own. So what we were saying is that technology must be feasible, but economically affordable, socially acceptable, and also environmentally sound. And some of these technologies they described meet most of these criteria. So with some government push and people's help, that or any other technology that is low carbon and also serves development purposes, not just carbon is not alone enough, but it should serve other purposes, and that should be the goal. And I think technology does have a hope.
So you have hope?
Hope.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to say thank you to this amazing panel, and give them a round if you can. Yeah. All right.
Thank you.